Nobody in that sunlit dining room expected the housekeeper to answer back. But when Serena Voss opened her mouth, the woman who had spent 30 years managing the Alderton estate did something no one at that table had ever seen. She told the truth. It started as most things do in houses like that one, with a small cruelty dressed up as a reasonable request. The Alderton family home sat at the edge of Lake Muskoka, 3 hours north of Toronto, behind an iron gate and a long gravel drive that crunched under tires the way old money announces itself quietly. The house had 12 rooms, 4 fireplaces, and a dining room with windows that looked out over the water. On a clear morning you could see the far shore. On the morning everything changed. The lake was flat and gray and still, the way it gets before a storm decides whether it wants to arrive. Serena Voss had worked in that house for 29 years. She had started at 32, hired by Douglas Alderton's mother when the family still used the property every summer. She had stayed through 3 renovations, 2 deaths, 1 fire in the east kitchen, and more small indignities than she had ever bothered to count. She was 61 now, with hands that carried the proof of every year she had spent keeping that house standing. Douglas Alderton was 54, gray at the temples, generous in public, and careful to believe that generosity made him a good man. He had inherited the estate from his parents along with a company that made construction materials, and a guilt he had never quite learned how to carry. He was not unkind. That was the important thing about Douglas. He was not unkind. He had simply learned over many years to look away from the places where kindness was actually needed. His fiancée, Priscilla Ham, had arrived 3 months earlier with 2 large suitcases, a small dog with a rhinestone collar, and opinions about how the house was being managed that she shared freely and often. Nobody had asked her to come to the Muskoka house. She had suggested it, and Douglas had agreed the way Douglas agreed to most things Priscilla suggested, which was to say he had not said no fast enough. That morning the extended family had gathered for what Douglas called a casual lunch, which in the Alderton vocabulary meant fine china, pressed linens and wine before noon. His sister Nora Alderton Finch had driven up from Hamilton with her husband and their 2 adult children. His cousin Raymond Alderton had arrived from Calgary, loud and certain of his own opinions as always. Douglas's son from his first marriage, Christopher, was there too, quiet and watchful in the way young men are when they have learned that the family table is not always a safe place to speak. Serena had been awake since 5. She had made the coffee, set the breakfast things, cleared them away, prepped the soup for lunch, arranged the flowers Douglas had requested on the center of the table, and had just returned to the dining room to check the place settings when Priscilla Ham appeared in the doorway, in a white linen dress and her morning authority. "Those flowers are wrong," Priscilla said without greeting. Serena looked at the arrangement. White peonies and green stems, exactly as Douglas had described them to her by phone 2 days earlier. "Mr. Alderton asked for peonies," Serena said. "I know what he asked for. I am telling you they are wrong. They crowd the sightline across the table. Take them down." Serena did not move immediately. Not from defiance. Simply from the small pause a person takes before they perform a task that makes no sense. She was measuring whether to say anything, the way she had measured that distance 10,000 times in 29 years, and nearly always chosen silence. "I would prefer to confirm with Douglas before I change what he requested," she said carefully. Priscilla Ham walked into the room with her small dog trailing behind her. She stopped at the head of the table and looked at Serena the way a person looks at a problem they are surprised still exists. "I don't think you understand your role here," Priscilla said. "Your role is not to confirm things with Douglas. Your role is to manage this house according to the preferences of the family." "Yes," Serena said. "And Douglas is the family." The dining room went quiet. Not dramatically. The way rooms go quiet when something true has been said in a place where truth wasn't invited. Priscilla's expression shifted. A cooling, a settling of something behind her eyes. She stepped closer to Serena until there was very little space between them and the room smelled of her perfume, expensive and floral, the kind that doesn't ask permission. "Excuse me," Priscilla said softly. "I meant no disrespect," Serena said. "I only meant that until you and Douglas are married, I look to him for final direction on the house." Priscilla's voice lowered to the particular register that some wealthy women use when they want to seem composed while meaning to wound. "You have been in this house a long time," she said. "Long enough to forget that tenure is not the same as authority." Serena held her hands in front of her, the way she had learned to hold them over the years. Still not clasped from nerves, simply still. "I haven't forgotten anything," she said. Priscilla studied her. Then she said, "If you cannot adjust to how things will be managed from now on, perhaps we should discuss whether this arrangement still makes sense." There it was, the threat dressed as a suggestion. Every person who has ever worked in a house like that one knows the shape of it. "We should discuss whether this arrangement makes sense." 4 words that mean 1 word. Leave. Serena looked at Priscilla Ham. She looked at the white linen dress and the small dog and the rhinestone collar, and the woman who had arrived 3 months ago and was already deciding who belonged in a house she had not yet inherited. And then Serena said something she had not planned to say. Miss Ham, she said quietly, I have kept this house for 29 years. I kept it when Douglas's father was dying in the upstairs bedroom and couldn't remember his own name. I kept it when his mother sat at this table every morning for 6 months after and couldn't eat. I kept it through the fire and the flood, and the summer that Douglas nearly lost the company. I have kept every room in this house the way people keep things they love. The dining room was completely silent. The clock on the mantel ticked. I will change the flowers if Douglas asks me to, Serena continued, but I will not change them because you have decided you'd prefer it. Nobody moved. Priscilla opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. You, she said, are making a very serious mistake. Maybe, Serena said, but it's mine to make. She turned back to the table and straightened one fork that didn't need straightening, and waited for the sound of Priscilla leaving the room. The sound came. Heels on hardwood, disappearing toward the east wing. For one moment in the winter morning quiet of the Alderton dining room, Serena stood alone by the flowers she had chosen, and felt something she could not quite name. Not victory, not pride. Something older and simpler. The feeling of having stood in the place where you were standing. The family began arriving for lunch at noon. Nora Alderton Finch came in first, the way she always did, filling a room with energy before she'd taken off her coat. She was 51, 2 years younger than Douglas, and she had inherited their mother's practicality and their father's temper, and had managed over the years to make those two things work together reasonably well. She kissed Serena on the cheek in the entryway, which was not a custom of the house. It was a custom of Nora's. The drive was gorgeous, she said. The color on those trees, have you seen it? Serena, you live here and you probably don't even look anymore. I look, Serena said, and she meant it. Raymond Alderton arrived from the east by rental car, his voice preceding him through the front door. Raymond was the sort of man who treated family gatherings as briefing sessions for his opinions. He had strong views on everything and held them loosely, and talked about both as if they were the same thing. Serena had always found him manageable in small doses. Christopher was last. He had parked down the lane instead of at the house, and he came through the kitchen door the way he always had since he was 12, quietly, with his boots already off. He was 31 now, with his mother's eyes and his father's quietness and a wariness around Priscilla Ham that he had never articulated but wore plainly on his face. Morning, he said to Serena. Lunch, actually, she said. You're late. He smiled. Just slightly. The way he smiled when someone treated him like he was still 12. Lunch was set for 12:30. Douglas arrived from his study at 10 past, kissed Priscilla at the head of the stairs, and came down looking like a man who had just been reminded of something he'd been trying not to think about. Serena watched all of it from the edges of rooms the way she had always watched. She was very good at the edges of rooms. The lunch began simply enough. Nora asked about the company. Raymond offered unsolicited opinions about the housing market. Christopher ate his soup and listened. Douglas asked after Nora's children, and Nora answered with the specific kind of parental detail that seems like sharing, but is actually a performance for the person who asked. Priscilla said very little. She sat at the far end of the table from Douglas with her posture perfect, and her wineglass touched but not drunk, and her eyes moving around the room in the way of someone keeping score. Serena came in to clear the soup bowls. She had her back to the table when Priscilla spoke. Douglas, Priscilla said in the particular tone that meant the conversation she was having was not the one she appeared to be having. I think we need to discuss the household staffing before the end of the year. Douglas looked up from the bread basket. Serena's hands not slow. What about it? Douglas asked. I've been thinking, Priscilla said, that a house this size, when it becomes a family home again, will need different management, a more modern structure, someone who understands how things are done now. Nora's fork stopped. Christopher looked at his water glass. We have, Serena, Douglas said with the mild confidence of a man who considers a matter settled. We do, Priscilla said pleasantly. And Serena is clearly very dedicated. But dedicated and effective aren't always the same thing, are they? Serena set the last soup bowl on the tray. She did not hurry. She did not slow down. She picked up the tray and carried it to the side table and set it down with steady hands. Then she turned. She had not planned to speak. 29 years of measured silence does not plan for the moment it ends. It simply ends. I'm sorry, Serena said. I don't want to interrupt. Serena? I want to ask something, if I may. The table had gone very quiet. Raymond put down his fork. Nora watched Serena with an expression that was half recognition and half held breath. Go ahead, Douglas said. Serena looked at him, not at Priscilla. At Douglas. In 29 years, she said. Has this house ever been managed in a way that caused you difficulty? Has there been a year in which the repairs weren't made, the accounts weren't right, the family wasn't taken care of? Douglas blinked. No, he said. No, Serena, of course not. Then what is it? She said carefully. That needs to be managed differently. The dining room held the question like something breakable. Priscilla set her wine glass down. I don't think this is the appropriate time for this conversation. You started the conversation, Nora said. Quietly. Simply the way women who have been holding their tongues for 3 months say the first true thing they've said in all that time. Priscilla looked at Nora. I'm sorry? You brought it up, Nora said. Serena has right to respond. This is a private family discussion. It's about Serena, Nora said. And she's standing right here. Raymond for once said nothing. He was watching Priscilla the way someone watches weather they didn't predict. Priscilla turned back to Serena with a smile that had nothing warm in it. I have nothing against you personally, she said. I simply think that a house in transition needs someone who can adapt to change. That's all I was suggesting. Serena looked at her. With respect, Miss Ham, she said, this house has been in transition for 29 years, 3 renovations, 2 bereavements, 1 serious fire, a market crash that nearly took the company. I have adapted to every change this house has asked me to adapt to. She paused. The one thing I will not adapt to is being managed out of a home I have kept faithfully, by someone who has been in it for 3 months. The room was absolutely still. Douglas stared at Serena. She had never spoken that way in front of him before. Not because she lacked the thoughts, because he had never forced the situation to the place where the thoughts needed to be spoken. Priscilla's voice came back controlled and cold. You are an employee. Yes, Serena said. I am, and I have done my job well. For nearly 3 decades. You will find that in every record, every account, every letter this family has written about the management of this estate. Christopher looked up for the first time, including the one my grandmother wrote, Sarissa continued, the year before she died, in which she asked Douglas to ensure I was taken care of, whatever happened to the house. The table shifted. Douglas's face changed. A small thing, a door opening behind his eyes that he had not meant to open. Priscilla folded her napkin on the table with precision. I was not aware of any such letter. No, Serena said. You weren't. Douglas pushed back his chair. He didn't stand fully, he simply shifted the way a man shifts when the ground beneath a conversation has moved. Serena, he said. Is there something you need to tell me? And that was the question. That was the one she had been moving toward for 29 years without knowing it. Yes, she said. I think there is. What Serena said next did not happen quickly. There was a moment in the silence between Douglas's question and her answer, when the whole dining room seemed to hold its breath. The lake outside the tall windows was flat and dark. The flowers on the center of the table, the white peonies, still there, still wrong according to Priscilla Ham, caught the pale afternoon light and held it. Then Serena spoke. Your mother left more than a letter, she said. She left something she asked me to give you when the time was right. She paused, and her hands pressed together in front of her, not from nerves but from the effort of decades finally releasing. I don't think I chose the right time. I think the time chose itself. Douglas stood now, fully. What are you talking about? Nora had gone very still. Christopher hadn't moved in several minutes. Raymond was watching with his mouth slightly open. Serena looked at Douglas. Your mother came to me the autumn before she died. She was already ill then, though the family didn't know how ill. She came to my room on a Tuesday evening. I remember because it was the night of the first frost, and I had just put the garden furniture away. And she sat down at my small table and she told me she had done something she wasn't sure she could undo. Douglas's voice was low. What had she done? Serena's hands loosened. She told me about a child. The room shifted the way rooms shift when a sentence lands that cannot be taken back. What child, Douglas? Serena said. Born before you. Before Nora. When your parents were very young and not yet married, and your grandfather had opinions about who your father could love and who he couldn't. She stopped. Her voice held steady. Your mother was 19. The boy was sent away before she ever held him. Nora made a sound. Small, involuntary. Douglas stood at the table with his hands flat against the wood and his face doing the work of a man who is trying to understand something too large to be understood all at once. She never told me, he said. She couldn't, Serena said. She tried, I think. Several times over the years. But by the time she found the courage, she was afraid of what it would mean for the family, for the company, for your father's memory. Serena paused. She thought the harm of telling might outweigh the harm of silence. It didn't, Douglas said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just the truth of it. No, Serena agreed. It didn't. Priscilla's voice came from the end of the table, precise and careful. This is an extraordinary claim to make at a family lunch, she said. Based on the word of a household employee. Christopher turned and looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her directly all afternoon. She was my grandmother's confidence, he said quietly. That's not nothing. Priscilla did not answer him. Douglas looked at Serena. You said she left something, yes. Where is it? Serena took a breath. My room. I'll get it. She walked out of the dining room under the weight of every eye at the table. Down the hall past the photographs of 3 generations of Aldertons on the wall. Past the room where Douglas's mother had died. Past the east window that had always stuck in winter. Her room was at the end of the servants' corridor. Small and clean and hers. And she went directly to the wardrobe and reached to the shelf above the hanging clothes where she had kept the envelope for 9 years, in the same spot, undisturbed, waiting for something she had not known how to name. The envelope was cream-colored and sealed and addressed in Margaret Alderton's handwriting to her son. On the back flap in the same careful hand were 5 words, only to be opened together. Serena had never opened it. She had come close twice. Once after Douglas's father died, and once after she had watched Priscilla Ham walk through the house for the 3rd time, with a measuring look that had nothing to do with affection. Both times she had put it back. She carried it back to the dining room. The table looked the same. 5 people, the remains of lunch, the lake beyond the glass. And yet the room was entirely different from the room she had left. Serena placed the envelope in front of Douglas. He looked at his mother's handwriting for a long time. Nora leaned over. Her hand went to her mouth. Christopher looked at the envelope and then at Serena and then back at the envelope. Raymond said, for once without theatrics, Douglas. Douglas picked up the envelope. He broke the seal slowly. Inside was a single folded letter, and beneath it, a smaller piece of paper folded separately, and beneath that a photograph. Douglas unfolded the letter first. He read it without speaking. His face moved through several expressions without settling on any of them. When he reached the end he looked up, and for a moment he was not the man who owned a construction company and a Muskoka estate and a fiancée with opinions. He was just a man who had just read his mother's handwriting for the first time since she died. She says his name is Edmund, Douglas said. His voice was thick. Edmund Tran. He was born in the spring of 1959. She says she found him 20 years ago. She knew where he was and she never... He stopped, he swallowed. She found him and she never told him who he was. Nora was crying quietly. She had not even reached for a napkin. She was simply letting it happen. There's a photograph, Douglas said. He unfolded the smaller piece of paper. Inside was a photograph, black and white, old enough that the edges had gone soft. A young woman stood in a garden. She was perhaps 19 or 20, in a summer dress with her hair pinned up, and she was smiling the way people smile when they don't know they are going to regret the moment the photograph represents. It was Margaret Alderton. Standing beside her with one hand at her elbow was a young man who looked at the camera with eyes that were not Douglas's eyes and not Nora's eyes. They were Serena's eyes. Serena had not planned for this moment any more than she had planned for the one in the dining room an hour earlier. She had kept the envelope for 9 years and told herself she was keeping it for Douglas, for the right time, for the family. She had not let herself think too carefully about the photograph. She had seen it once, the day Margaret pressed the envelope into her hands, and she had folded it back inside quickly and sealed it away, because she knew the young man in the photograph. She had known him her whole life. The table had gone very quiet. Douglas was looking at the photograph. Then he was looking at Serena, then at the photograph. Serena, he said, and that was all. Just her name. Serena sat down. Nobody asked her to. She simply sat in the chair nearest her because her legs had decided that was what was happening. My father, she said, was a young man from Saigon who came to Ontario in 1957 with nothing but 2 suitcases and a brother who'd come the year before. He worked at a cannery in Brantford for 3 years, then he moved north. She stopped. He told me once that his best year was the year he spent working for a family near Muskoka. He never said which family. I didn't ask. I was 11. The clock on the mantel ticked. His name was Bao Tran, Serena said. In English he used Bernard. He died when I was 26. Nora pressed both hands to her face. Douglas set the photograph down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid of what you'll do if you grip it any longer. Your father, he said slowly, is the man in this photograph. Yes, Serena said. Which means, he said. Yes, she said again. Edmund is my brother. The word landed the way words land when they have been waiting 9 years to be spoken. Priscilla stood up from her chair. The movement was small and contained and everyone in the room noticed it immediately, because it was the first time all afternoon that Priscilla Ham had done something that looked like retreat. Douglas, she said, and her voice had changed. The pleasantness was gone. What was underneath was not sadness. It was calculation. You need to be very careful here. This is an emotional moment, and emotional moments are when people make decisions they regret. Douglas looked at her. What decisions? An unknown half-sibling, she said, with a claim to the estate, introduced through the family's housekeeper. She paused. You see how this looks? Christopher's chair scraped back from the table. He stood. He was not tall, but he stood the way a person stands when they are done watching from a distance. It looks, he said, like my grandmother had a son she was forced to give up, and she trusted Serena to hold the truth until the family was ready to hear it. Priscilla looked at him with an expression that meant he was not included in the adults in the room. Christopher held her look. He had his mother's eyes. He had his father's quietness, and he had, Serena noticed for the first time, something that belonged to neither of his parents, a steadiness. The kind you build yourself slowly from having decided what matters. She is not manipulating anyone, he said. She has been keeping something painful out of loyalty to a woman who died without fixing the wrong she'd done. He paused. And she deserves to be in this conversation, not managed out of it. Priscilla's mouth tightened. Douglas looked at his son, then at Serena, then at the photograph of his mother standing beside a young man from Saigon in a summer garden 65 years ago. Priscilla, he said. I need you to give us the room. Priscilla blinked. Excuse me, please, Douglas said. This is family. Something moved across Priscilla's face. A recalculation. A reading of the room. Fine, she said. But when you've finished with the family drama, we should talk about the fact that your family's housekeeper has been sitting on this information for 9 years. She looked at Serena. 9 years. Whatever her reasons, that is not loyalty. That is control. She picked up her wine glass, walked to the doorway and stopped. She decided when you were ready, Priscilla said. Did anyone ask if you got to decide that for yourselves? Then she walked out. The question stayed. Serena heard it. She felt it settle over her the way an honest thing settles when the person saying it intends it as a weapon, but has accidentally told the truth. Douglas was looking at her. 9 years, he said. Yes, why? His voice was not angry. It was something more complicated. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Serena was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was not simple, and she did not believe in making complicated things simple. Because your mother asked me not to tell you while your father was still alive, she said. She thought it would destroy him, and I believed her. She paused. And then he died, and I told myself you were still grieving, and then Nora had her health difficulties, and then the company crisis, and I kept finding reasons why this week was not the right week. She looked at her hands. The truth is I was afraid. Afraid it would change everything. Afraid you would ask why I hadn't told you sooner, and now you are asking. Douglas was quiet. Nora spoke from across the table, her voice rough from crying. You loved her, she said. You loved Mum. Yes, Serena said. Then you were protecting her, even after she was gone. I was protecting everyone, Serena said, which means I was protecting no one. I know that. Douglas picked up the photograph again. He looked at the young man standing beside his mother in the summer garden. He thought of the half-brother he had never met, living somewhere with a name his mother had chosen and a life she had watched from a distance. And a past he probably didn't know was connected to this house. Edmund Tran, Douglas said. Does he know any of this? The letter says she wrote to him, Serena said. Once. She says she told him she was looking for something to leave him. But she never sent the letter. Douglas lowered the photograph. Why not? Serena looked at him. She was afraid of the same things you're going to be afraid of, she said. She was afraid he would hate her. She was afraid the family would be changed. She was afraid of what her choices had cost someone else, and she didn't know how to hold that. She didn't have to hold it alone. Nora said. No, Serena said softly. She didn't. Raymond, who had not spoken in a very long time, set his elbows on the table and said, Where is he now? The brother. Serena looked at the smaller folded paper still on the table. There's an address, she said. Or there was 9 years ago, somewhere in Winnipeg. Douglas picked up the small paper. He unfolded it. He looked at the address for a long moment. Then he stood up fully and put the paper in his shirt pocket and walked to the window and stood looking out at the lake. The water was very still. The far shore was a dark line of trees against a pale sky. Nobody rushed him. That was one of the things Serena had always valued about this family, when they were at their best. They knew how to sit with something. They had learned it from grief and from winter and from years of long silences around this table. After a while, Douglas turned back. I'm going to find him, he said. Nora let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for the entire lunch. Christopher nodded once. Raymond made a sound that managed to be both surprised and unsurprised. Douglas looked at Serena. Will you help me? The question came to her the way the whole afternoon had come to her, without warning, with complete clarity. Of course I will. Douglas held her look for a moment. You should have come to me sooner, he said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was honest. I know, Serena said. I'm sorry. He nodded. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of understanding, which is where forgiveness always starts. There were other conversations that afternoon. There were the conversations about what to say to Priscilla, which Douglas handled with a directness that Serena had never seen in him before, and that Christopher watched with something close to relief. There were the conversations among the siblings, Nora and Douglas and Raymond, about what they knew and hadn't known, and what it meant that their parents had carried a secret for 60 years through a marriage and a family, and a house that always looked, from the outside, like a place where everything was accounted for. Those conversations happened without Serena. They were right to. Some things are the family's to hold. But later, when the guests had gone to their rooms and the kitchen was clean, and the peonies were still standing in their vase on the dining room table, Douglas came and found her. She was in the back sitting room with a cup of tea, and the lake going dark beyond the window. He sat down in the chair across from her without asking. Christopher told me, he said, what Priscilla said to you this morning. Ah, Serena said. Before the lunch, Douglas said. About the flowers, and about your position. She wasn't wrong that the house will change, Serena said. Maybe, Douglas said. But she was wrong about how. He was quiet for a moment. I have not always paid enough attention to what's happening inside this house, I know that. He looked at his hands. My mother saw you more clearly than I did. Serena looked at him. She was a remarkable woman. She was a frightened one too, he said. At the end, people can be both. Douglas was quiet. I don't want to lose this, he said finally. What you've built here, the way this house has been. He paused. I know that's a complicated thing to say after what I heard today. It's an honest thing to say, Serena said. He looked at her. Will you stay? She considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. Not the way someone considers whether to accept a job offer, but the way since whether they still belong somewhere, and whether belonging is enough. For now, she said. Yes, while you find Edmund, while the family gets its footing. She paused. After that we'll see. Douglas nodded. It was the right answer and he knew it and he didn't try to change it. He stood. He put his hand briefly on the back of her chair as he left. The way his mother used to do when she passed through a room where Serena was sitting. And it almost stopped her breath. Then he was gone, and she was alone with the lake and the cooling tea and 29 years of a house that had finally decided to tell the truth. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, Douglas Alderton called his half-brother for the first time. Serena was in the kitchen when he made the call, and she heard nothing of what was said, because she had gone quietly into the pantry, and closed the door and stood there in the dark among the shelved preserves, and the spare linens and the small ordinary things a house keeps, because it intends to go on. She stayed there until she heard Douglas's voice change through the wall. Not the words, just the sound of it. The way a voice changes when the person using it has just made contact with something they have been looking for without knowing they were looking. Then she opened the pantry door and went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because in a house like that one, in a moment like that one, what you do is put the kettle on. The rest would take time. Edmund Tran would need time. The family would need time. The estate and the company, and the question of what Margaret Alderton had left behind, and who it belonged to would all need lawyers and patience, and the particular courage it takes to sit across from a stranger, who is also your blood and decide to stay in the room. Cecina knew all of that. She had spent 29 years learning how houses hold their people through hard seasons, and she knew that this one would hold. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the lake come back to light. It was a clear morning finally. You could see all the way to the far shore.